In January 2026, the United States threatened to use military force against Denmark, a founding member of NATO, unless it surrendered Greenland. President Trump imposed tariffs on 8 European allies and declared that acquiring the Arctic island was an absolute necessity for American security. This ultimatum came just 2 weeks after United States Special Forces raided Caracas, captured Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro, and extracted him to face charges in the United States. The message was clear. When Trump threatened Greenland with the hard way, he had already demonstrated he meant it. To understand this crisis, we need to explore 3 questions. Why has the United States pursued Greenland for over 150 years? What strategic imperatives drive the 2026 ultimatum? And what happens when a great power demands territory from a democratic ally in the name of national security?
On January 17, 2026, President Trump issued an ultimatum via social media. He announced a 10% tariff on all goods from 8 European nations: Denmark, Norway, Sweden, France, Germany, the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, and Finland. The tariff would increase to 25% on June 1st unless a deal was reached for the complete purchase of Greenland. The targeted countries were selected specifically because they had sent military personnel to Greenland in solidarity with Denmark. The economic stakes are substantial. Germany exports automobiles and machinery worth hundreds of billions of dollars to the United States annually. Denmark exports pharmaceuticals, including insulin produced by Novo Nordisk, valued at $12 billion per year. A 25% tariff could trigger a recession in the Eurozone. But the tariffs were only one dimension of the pressure. When asked whether military action was on the table, President Trump stated, "One way or the other, we are going to have Greenland." He explicitly refused to rule out what he called the hard way. For leaders in Copenhagen and Nuuk, the capital of Greenland, these threats carried unprecedented credibility. Just 2 weeks earlier, United States Special Forces had executed the Caracas raid, demonstrating that the administration was willing to violate the sovereignty of nations it deemed hostile to American interests. The assumption that American threats were merely rhetorical had been shattered.
The response from Greenland was immediate and unified. On January 18th, an estimated 4,000 people, roughly 25% of Nuuk's population, marched through the capital carrying signs, reading, "You cannot buy a people." Premier Jens Frederik Nielsen stated publicly, "Greenland does not want to be governed by the United States." Denmark's response was equally firm. Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen declared that Greenland was not for sale and warned that any use of force would render the NATO alliance defunct. She emphasized a constitutional reality. Under the Act on Greenland Self-Government passed in 2009, Denmark no longer has the authority to transfer Greenland's sovereignty without the explicit consent of the Greenlandic people. European allies moved beyond rhetoric. Germany, France, Sweden, and Norway rapidly deployed military personnel to Greenland under Operation Arctic Endurance. While the numbers were small, fewer than 100 personnel, their symbolic weight was immense. These troops serve as a tripwire. Any American military action would now risk engaging the armed forces of NATO allies. But why does the United States want Greenland so badly? To answer that, we must go back to 1867.
The intellectual lineage of the current crisis traces directly to Secretary of State William Seward. In 1867, Seward orchestrated the purchase of Alaska from the Russian Empire for $7.2 million. Critics derided it as Seward's folly, a frozen wasteland with no apparent value. But Seward's vision was strategic, not economic. He envisioned a United States that controlled the northern approaches to the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. In the same year, he purchased Alaska. Seward commissioned a comprehensive report on the strategic value of Greenland and Iceland. While political backlash prevented him from pursuing Greenland, the 1867 inquiry established a foundational precedent. Washington defined the island as within its sphere of influence. The most direct parallel to the modern crisis occurred in the immediate aftermath of World War II. During the war, the United States assumed de facto protection of Greenland while Denmark was under Nazi occupation. In 1946, Secretary of State James Burns, acting under President Harry Truman, made a secret offer to purchase Greenland for $100 million in gold bars. The offer was driven by the nascent Cold War. The Joint Chiefs of Staff had designated Greenland as a military necessity for the interception of Soviet bombers.
Denmark rejected the purchase. However, a compromise was reached in 1951 with the Defense of Greenland Agreement. This treaty granted the United States extensive basing rights at Thule Air Base, now known as Pituffik Space Base, without transferring sovereignty. This agreement successfully decoupled use from ownership for 75 years. The issue lay dormant until August 2019, when President Trump revived the idea. He discussed it with aides and confirmed his interest to the press. Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen termed the proposal absurd, leading to a diplomatic spat and the cancellation of a state visit. Trump called Frederiksen nasty and complained about the rejection.
In retrospect, the 2019 incident was not a gaffe, but a preview. It signaled a shift in American policy that prioritized direct territorial control over alliance-based access. The transition from the absurd proposal of 2019 to the existential ultimatum of 2026 reflects a deteriorating security environment in the Arctic and the administration's rejection of soft power in favor of transactional coercion. The Venezuela raid in January 2026 fundamentally changed the calculus. When Trump stated regarding Greenland that if we do not do it the easy way, we are going to do it the hard way, the precedent of Caracas gave that threat tangible credibility. The raid demonstrated that the administration was willing to use military force to achieve objectives it deemed vital, regardless of international law. But if the United States already has a military base in Greenland, why does Trump insist on ownership? What changed? To understand that, we need to examine the strategic imperative driving this crisis. The Golden Dome.
The primary operational justification for the American demand is the Golden Dome, a proposed multi-layer missile defense architecture announced by President Trump in early 2025. The technical specifications of the Golden Dome rely heavily on the unique geography of Greenland. The strategic value of Greenland is dictated by the geometry of the Earth. The Great Circle Route, the shortest path for a ballistic missile traveling from the Russian Federation or the People's Republic of China to the continental United States, passes directly over the Arctic and Greenland. This is not theory, it is physics. Currently, Pituffik Space Base hosts the upgraded early warning radar, which provides the earliest possible detection of a launch from the Eurasian landmass. However, the Golden Dome architecture requires more than just detection. It requires tracking and discrimination capability that necessitates a denser sensor network than the 1951 agreement currently permits.
To intercept hypersonic glide vehicles and advanced intercontinental ballistic missiles, defensive systems must engage targets earlier in their flight trajectory. Greenland sits beneath the boost and early mid-course phases of a trans-polar attack. Basing interceptors in Greenland offers a kinetic advantage that cannot be replicated from Alaska or the continental United States. The interceptors would have more time to reach their targets, and the engagement geometry is more favorable. The Trump administration has mobilized the industrial base for this effort through the SHIELD contract, Scalable Homeland Innovative Enterprise Layered Defense, a $151 billion vehicle designed to rapid prototype the Golden Dome's components. The architecture envisions a constellation of space-based sensors and potentially space-based interceptors. Greenland is critical for the ground segment of this space architecture. Polar orbiting satellites pass over the poles on every revolution, approximately every 90 minutes. Ground stations in northern Greenland allow for data downlink and command uplink on every orbit, a capability essential for the real-time fire control loops required by the Golden Dome. Without Greenland, there would be gaps in coverage during critical phases of an attack.
The administration argues that renting such a vital node from Denmark creates an unacceptable vulnerability. If a future Danish government were to restrict American access due to political disagreements, for example over climate policy or trade, the American missile shield could be blinded. Thus, sovereignty is viewed as a prerequisite for the reliability of the strategic deterrent. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent stated on NBC's Meet the Press, "The president believes enhanced security is not possible without Greenland being part of the United States." However, experts have challenged this rationale. Marion Messmer, director of the International Security Program at London's Chatham House think tank, acknowledged that Russia and China have increased their military activities in the Arctic in recent years. However, she stated, "What is not clear is why Washington needs full control over Greenland to defend itself."
Critics point out that the current 1951 defense agreement already grants the United States extensive rights. Furthermore, NATO ambassadors in Brussels have proposed a permanent Arctic sentry mission, modeled on the Baltic air policing missions, which would involve rotating Allied aircraft and naval vessels to Greenland. This proposal attempts to give the United States enhanced security without transferring sovereignty. However, the Trump administration has rejected this as insufficient. The administration views multilateral solutions as rented security that does not solve the fundamental issue of control. From Washington's perspective, the physics of missile defense and the $151 billion investment in the Golden Dome make Greenland a non-negotiable strategic asset. The administration frames the acquisition as necessary for the safety of the American homeland. From the perspective of Denmark and Greenland, the situation looks entirely different. The demand violates constitutional and international law. Prime Minister Frederiksen has warned that any use of force would end NATO. Greenlandic voices emphasize that they seek independence from Denmark eventually, but not annexation by the United States. For the Greenlandic Inuit, who comprise 88% of the island's 56,000 inhabitants, the American proposal evokes colonial trauma.
Faced with European refusal, President Trump escalated by weaponizing trade policy. The 10% tariff, scheduled to increase to 25% on June 1st, holds the German automotive industry and Danish pharmaceutical sector hostage for a territorial exchange. However, early market reactions suggest that rather than capitulating, the European Union is preparing countermeasures, raising the specter of a full-scale transatlantic trade war. Parallel to the defense imperative is the economic necessity of securing supply chains for critical minerals. Greenland holds the Kvanefjeld deposit, one of the world's largest undeveloped reserves of rare earth elements. These elements are essential for permanent magnets used in electric vehicles, wind turbines, and advanced military guidance systems. The geopolitical friction arises from Chinese involvement. Shenge Resources, a Chinese rare earth giant, is the largest shareholder in the company holding the exploration license. The United States views this as strategic encirclement. The Trump administration's calculus appears to be that acquiring sovereignty would allow the United States to override local environmental legislation and unlock the deposit for American industry while permanently excluding Chinese equity holders.
The military dimension has moved beyond theoretical planning. Denmark activated Operation Arctic Endurance in immediate response to American threats. Germany, France, Sweden, and Norway deployed personnel. While totaling less than 100, their diplomatic weight is immense. They serve as a tripwire. A United States military move against Greenlandic institutions would now risk engaging not just Danish forces, but the armed forces of France, Germany, and the United Kingdom. The legal question is fundamental. Denmark cannot sell Greenland. Under the Act on Greenland Self-Government, passed in 2009, the Danish government has no constitutional authority to transfer the territory without the explicit consent of the Greenlandic people via referendum. Any treaty signed under duress would be void under Danish domestic law and likely invalid under international law. The United Nations issued a statement categorizing the American attempt as evoking a logic of colonial domination that the international community has long rejected.
With the June 1st tariff escalation deadline approaching, the world faces three possible scenarios. Scenario 1 is the transactional compromise. The United States drops the demand for full sovereignty in exchange for a 99-year sovereign lease over expanded military zones for the Golden Dome sites. This scenario aligns with Trump's transactional nature and offers Greenland a way to secure economic support without losing autonomy. However, it requires environmental parties and the public to accept uranium mining linked to the rare earth extraction. Scenario 2 is the Atlantic rupture. Trump refuses to back down. The 25% tariffs trigger European Union retaliation. The West splits into two economic blocs. Greenland remains Danish, but the United States creates friction at Pituffik. This scenario appears increasingly likely. The credibility trap created by the Venezuela raid makes a climb down difficult for the administration.
Scenario 3 is the hard way. Citing an imminent threat, such as alleged Chinese covert activity or Russian submarine incursions, the United States unilaterally expands its security perimeter around Pituffik and Kvanefjeld, effectively annexing the strategic zones. This would trigger the tripwire forces and precipitate a global diplomatic crisis. The stakes extend far beyond Greenland. For NATO, the question is whether the alliance can survive a member threatening another member with military force. If the alliance fractures, Russia and China benefit immensely. For international law, the crisis poses a fundamental question. Can a great power seize territory from a democratic ally by claiming national security necessity? If the United States succeeds, it undermines the entire post-World War II system of sovereignty and self-determination. For the Arctic, the crisis marks the end of an era. The region was a zone of low tension where cooperation on scientific research prevailed. Climate change is opening new shipping routes and making resource extraction viable. The struggle for Greenland signals that the Arctic has become a zone of great power competition.
The Greenland crisis reveals a fundamental tension in the 21st century world order. When a great power declares that its security requires control over the territory of a democratic ally, what happens to the rules-based system? From Washington's perspective, the physics of missile defense make Greenland a strategic imperative. The Golden Dome architecture, the $151 billion investment, and the Great Circle geometry of ballistic missile trajectories create a compelling case for American policymakers. From Copenhagen and Nuuk, the same situation looks like an attempt to buy people as if they were real estate, erasing indigenous self-determination in the process. History shows that nations rarely sell territory voluntarily when they have a choice. Today's Denmark is prosperous and backed by NATO. Today's Greenland has recognized rights under international law that did not exist a century ago. The outcome remains uncertain, but one reality is clear. The Arctic is no longer a frozen periphery. It has become the center of the storm. If you want to understand global affairs beyond the headlines, consider subscribing.